I was very fortunate to get to look underneath the hood and see what Qball was, and I think there's real possibility inherent in the sport in some of the features it has. And I say that from looking at the issue of the evolution of sports historically, and we have not had a really viable new sport come along since basketball was invented. And the idea that you essentially have to find a sport that taps into things that current sports aren't doing is very powerful, and I think Qball has a genuine possibility of doing that. But the real value of sports is actually intrinsic and aesthetic, and that's why kids wanted to play the game, because they saw the beauty of of controlling the ball, of throwing the ball, of a well-worked give and go, of a perfectly thrown pass, of a well-thrown curve ball, whatever those things were. And it's that intrinsic aesthetic quality that actually is central to whether a sport ultimately has appeal to it. Right away they saw that there was this rich form of human expression that they could have by playing any number of sports, whether it was kicking the ball, or whether it was involving a bat, or whether it was a goal-oriented game like hockey, where you're using a puck and a stick. All these were vehicles for a wide variety of human expressions, and that's ultimately the power of sports. And again, the moral value ultimately is aesthetic and intrinsic, right? It's that it allows for such a wide variety of forms of physical expression, emotional expression, and social expression. Most people would be surprised to learn that actually what we call football started out as soccer. That first game between Princeton and Rutgers in 1869 was actually a soccer game. Between 1874 and 1880, because of Harvard, it actually became rugby. But in 1880, a man named Walter Camp decided that rugby was too simple of a game, and that it was still play, and that it represented sort of feudalism, that the game essentially represented the past, and that we should have an American game that represented the rapid industrialization and modernization of the United States. And so he consciously made one simple rule change to bring about that vision. And simply put, he decided that we should replace the scrum of rugby, where when a person's tackled they put the ball on the ground and play is continuous, with a scrimmage. And it led to was almost unimaginable violence, because what happened was that in rugby you can't block, but in American football you could block. And so you opened up this Pandora's box that the NFL and football have not closed to this day, that essentially how do we make the game less violent. And it was really inherent in what Camp did, and people think that violence promotes sports and that football is intrinsic. But in reality, it became so distasteful that not only did the moral reformers start to threaten to abolish football, California and Stanford, for example, went back to rugby in the early 20th century, but fans started to get turned off by the sport because it lacked any entertainment value. It became incredibly difficult for players the running backs, for example, to do well. And it really wasn't until another rule came in, the Ford Pass, between 1905 and 1915, that you actually created the modern football game we now see with it, that has become effectively the biggest sport in the United States. But you see how there's sort of this constant tension between legalism, violence, and the demand for public entertainment that the NFL and college football and all levels of football are negotiating to this day. Baseball in a lot of ways represents an idealization of America, of a game that's still controlled by the players, of a game that is still played on a field, where there is no sense of time. Football represents the opposite for America. Football represents the ineluctable march of modernity. And I think part of what goes on is most people can identify, whether they like it or not, and they may not like their own job, but they nonetheless relate to that ineluctable march of modernity far better than they relate to a game that represents an America that is bygone. I mean, it's very interesting. So basketball was invented in 1891, and I think the first thing we should ask is, why was it invented? What was Naismith's reason for coming up for it? And I think this, because it's very instructive. He wanted to fill a need that wasn't there, right? Basically, we had baseball for the summer, we had football for the fall. He had all these young men filled with energy, and he wanted to find some way for them to have some kind of healthy outlet for that energy. And so the basketball essentially was invented as a form of outlet, for that time. So the importance here, I think, is one thing you want to look at is is how can a sport meet a need that isn't currently being met? How can it do something that other sports are failing to do in this case? And that also is going to have, be sufficiently athletic for people to really want to do. And that's what that Naismith's idea here of an indoor sport in general and basketball in particular sort of met that need, right? And it to this day, it develops culturally. That's its niche within the American sporting calendar, right? And that speaks to the fact that basketball has found the power as a sport to communicate to a large part of the population that baseball isn't. And so we ought to ask what that is. What is it about basketball as a sport that young people find, and African Americans especially, find so culturally compelling that they're not seeing in baseball? And I think that is because the game is played 5-on-5 and the ability to control the ball so well. Basketball allows for a level of self-expression that far exceeds what can generally be done in football or baseball. And I see, but most of the football players on the field are performing roles that essentially eclipse self-expression, right? Whereas basketball, inevitably, the individual self-expression largely eclipses the role. Even if you bring in someone for a specialized role who's just supposed to be a three-point shooter, for example, the demands of the game are such that that player at times is going to have to go to the basket. They're going to have to be called out for whether they can, they can cover defensively, whether they can help. And so, how can we create something on one end that has all the tactical sophistication of football, right? That fans get to wonk out on situation substitutions, managerial strategy, tactics, positioning. Yet at the same time, we want to see a game, if I may quote Pete Townsend, with hero, villains, and fools. We want to see the heart of the person on the field. We want to see the person who quits, the person who keeps on trying. We want to see the person who in a moment of high tension can't help but still want to enjoy themselves, like Magic Johnson did. And that's I think a sport that can meet both ends of that challenge. You have that air of that tactical sophistication on the one end that allows us to subject it to data, to systematic analysis, and on the other end allows us to see theater, allows us to see the human element. I mean, think about the introduction of Wide World of Sport. What is really ultimately compelling about sports? The human drama of athletic competition, the thrill of the victory and the agony of defeat. And you have to find a way to bring that human element together with that modern industrial element that we've so embraced in the United States. You have to constantly think, how can I make my sport more attractive from the point of view of the consumer, and try to think about what those elements are that promote that on here. So I would actually go to Sigmund Freud. So in Civilization is Discontent, he argues, and we won't go into too many details here, but he argues that in order for a community to function, we have to put aside our libidinal drives and all of our antagonisms and things we'd like to say to our members of our fellow community, moments of frustration, anxiety, and we have to act civil towards each other. So sports is a form of ritual. Imagine it, it creates an imaginary community that unites us together and makes us feel as though we have a collective identity. And that allows, on some level, communities to function in a civil way. In other words, we're not civil at the athletic event, but the lack of civility we exhibit at the athletic event actually engenders civility on a day-to-day basis in the community. So in Eugene Kaling's groundbreaking piece, The Well-Played Game, he talks about continuity. And he argues that we need to understand that sports is a dramatic medium like theater, but he goes, secondly, we need to understand in terms of its kinesthetic elements, it's most comparable to dance. And he essentially there's a flow to it that if the game is good, that gives it that kind of dance-like quality, or the balletic grace, rhythm of movement. So you have these large trends in sports, that help these sports emerge. We've now gone a century without any real new sport emerging, yet the times have changed. People have changed, American history has changed, our economy has changed, and Qball could be the sport that emerges in response to these changing conditions. It's not a question of whether a new sport will emerge. In all probability, a new sport will emerge, and Qball has the potential to fill that important role and respond to the needs, the ever-evolving needs of both the American people and people in other countries.
So there you have a wonderful introduction from an expert, Dr. Kenneth Pendleton, about the evolution of modern sports and the even deeper meaning of sports throughout history. And this process is not over. Why should it be? Just as baseball, football, and basketball all developed from their beginnings in the 1800s. As Dr. Pendleton notes, new sports will emerge as they have throughout all of history. What is astonishing is that it is over 120 years now since James Naismith, pictured here in Springfield, Massachusetts, invented the last major sport, basketball. In fact, truly new team sports are not easy to invent, and why they are not invented all that often. We at New Sports Group are confident that we have in Qball, the sport's abbreviated name, a new sport for our 21st century, and we'd like to tell you more. It has the potential to alter the sports landscape in America and throughout the globe in our fast-paced electronic world where new ideas and new products can and do spread with lightning speed. And it is certainly a good time for a disruptive new team sport. I am Arthur Piccolo, CEO, New Sports Group, LLC. Let me leave you with this thought. Imagine it is 1891 and you are in Springfield, Massachusetts, and you meet James Naismith, and you were there at the birth of basketball. What a priceless moment that would have been. And knowing what we know now, what you might have accomplished along with James Naismith.